Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. Hello everyone, this edition of the Fatigue Files podcast, I'm delighted to have Dr. Terry Marks-Tarlow, Clinical and Consulting Psychologist, author, artist, dancer and yogini. And I have asked Terry if we can discuss themes around attachment and coming home to the self. So Terry, attachment is a huge subject, isn't it?
Attachment is probably the most important subject for understanding our emotional growth and what we need early in life to be healthy and happy later in life.
Yeah, and it has huge implications, doesn't it, for adults who get to a certain point in their life and then there are sort of patterns that drive them maybe towards illness. I mean, many of us suffering fatigue have kind of had a crisis point in our lives when stuff's come home to roost. And in my experience, working with clients, quite a lot of that stuff is rooted in very early attachment dynamics.
Absolutely. Pretty much everything is in many ways, because attachment sets the stage for how we connect to others and how we connect to ourselves. And because it starts out in a completely nonverbal way and essentially unconscious in infants. I mean, attachment dynamics start right away. In fact, they start in the womb. And so they move from being completely unconsciously formulated so that our bodies are taken to places automatically by the nature of our relationship with other people and with our environment. And only later do we become conscious of what's happening. So, yes, the early problems in attachment. And just to give the audience a sense of what attachment has to do with, for those not familiar with it, it's really the idea that infants are born completely helpless and dependent on the environment. And the environment in the very beginning is our connection to early caregivers, which usually starts out being the mother as the primary one, but doesn't have to be the mother. It can be any other person who is there whenever the infant needs something. And so the infant's sense of agency has to do with the ability for the adults to know and sense and intuit what the infant needs, both emotionally and physically. And of course, there are going to be gaps in that. With any person, there will be certain gaps and in what's called attunement. And those gaps are what contribute later in life to problems or to difficulties in our relationships to other or our relationship to ourselves. And those gaps can be huge in the cases of abuse or neglect, or they can be tiny things that have to do with how our parents or caregivers themselves were parented and the gaps there. So these things tend to travel across the generations. Similar kinds of issues tend to move epigenetically from one generation to the next.
And I guess the key role there in attuned caregiver is also this art of co-regulation, because the baby is essentially an open nervous system, isn't it? It can't possibly self-regulate. So it relies on the regulation of the caregiver for its own regulation. And like you're saying, if the caregiver has poor nervous system regulation, they're not going to have the wherewithal to co-regulate an infant.
Yes, and that word that you are using, co-regulation, is key because it's not a one-way thing. The infant also regulates the caregiver, and so when an infant is unsoothable, for example, to a caregiver, that can dysregulate the caregiver in a circle of misattunement that goes on and on and on if we're not grounded. And so it's a two-way street always, just like all our relationships. The rest of our lives are two-way streets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm struck by the kind of multiple levels at which that communication takes place, because you've got kind of neurotransmitter activity, hormones, and other kinds of chemicals, not just the biological bonding, the gazing, the sense of presence or not presence, embodied settlement or, unsettlement. It's just happening on so many levels in so many layers, isn't it, Terry?
That's beautifully put, Anna. That's exactly so. There are multiple layers and they're all happening at one time. And they all begin with the body, but the emotions and the unconscious are in the body. And so these relational sequences, they start with these sequences of need and response that either the need is well responded to or it's not responded to, or just the nature of how it's responded to gets internalized and folded in. And our expectations for what's to come are formulated by these templates. They're like scripts that are nonverbal and emotional relational scripts. And something that you mentioned earlier before we started this, I think is so key, that not only do these scripts have to do with our relationship to other people, but eventually they have to do with our relationship to ourselves and whether we have a secure attachment with ourselves or an insecure attachment with ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And this opens up the possibility as well, doesn't, given that we're so mutable, the idea that we can actually address our attachment patterns, attachment wounds through self-attunement. We can actually, as it were, reparent, reattune to that inner infant. And obviously that's partly what happens in therapy with a good therapist, with the kind of open, unconditional positive regard, the ability to sit in a calm, comfortable way with discomfort, allowing the client to experience their discomfort safely and their trauma safely. But there are ways in which we can do this for ourselves too, Terry. And I wonder if you've got any reflections for people on this, because people with fatigue often have issues around this, because we know that attachment patterns and attachment wounds set up a whole orientation towards the world, which eventually comes home to rest in symptoms, as it were, produced by a dysfunctional nervous system, for example, produces symptoms in the body throughout. So what would you be advising clients in front of you? Say you've got a client who's got a very difficult attachment style and they're very ill at ease with themselves. Tell me, where would you take them?
Well, I'm reminded as you're speaking of inner child work is one way to go, and that's been around for quite a while. But a way to do that is to go back in memory and imagine yourself as an infant or as a child, and to remember the things that went wrong in the parenting, and then imagine yourself as stepping in as your own parent, and to give yourself the ideal, if possible, the ideal way of handling those situations or those absences or what was wrong in those early years, and to really, some people who have had a lot of problems in early childhood have a difficult time having compassion towards the self. But it can be easier if that child, if you think of the child as a different person than yourself, that might be a really good way of mustering up the empathy and the compassion that was lacking, and that continues to lack when we're self-critical or we're highly at dis-ease, meaning we have discomfort with ourselves, and that does turn into dis-ease in a literal sense in the body, but we tend to unconsciously carry on those early messages in our relationship to ourselves. So if you imagine your inner child as a different child that you are slated to take care of, it can be easier to wipe the slate clean and come up with exactly what was needed but not present in the early days. So that would be one way of doing it. Another way would be the Buddhist form of compassion meditation, which is the second wing of meditation. The first, or maybe it's the first wing, I'm not sure. Actually, they're probably neither one is first or second, because two wings are always needed on a bird. So they just go together. One wing is mindfulness, which is the ability to sit with ourselves and simply watch what's going on. But that doesn't tend to change how we feel, whereas compassion meditation does tend to change our level of happiness and contentment. And that involves picturing something or someone that we love dearly and sending love to that person, sending love to other people in the environment systematically. That might involve people that we are less fond of, trying to extend compassion to strangers or to even to enemies eventually. But most importantly, to bring it back to the self. And for people that have a hard time loving themselves, this can be a wonderful way of changing the internal emotional environment and trying to bring love to the self and compassion and empathy to the self. And so some people have such a hard time with self-compassion that they might start out with a pet. They absolutely adore their cat or their dog and can imagine stroking the cat and the dog and this sort of thing. And so trying to toggle back and forth between love for the pet or for the person and love for the self is also an important way of nourishing the self and starting to correct some of the absences, some of those early absences that weren't there.
I'm struck in both those examples by the power of imagination, by the absolute instantaneous portal we get to a capacity to change our embodied reality through the deployment of imagination, because the unconscious doesn't know the difference, does it, between something that really happened and something that we imagine happens. And actually, a lot of our so-called negative states are taking the form of imaginations where we project ourselves into situations and the body produces the chemicals and neurotransmitters appropriate to that experience. And thus our imagination becomes our biology. So it just strikes me the pivotal role in both those examples, the inner child work and the loving compassion practice of imagination. And in particular, you mentioned the word picturing. So I'd love your thoughts on the role of the visual cortex, because some people find it difficult to visualize, but I assume as well you could use your kinesthetic sense. You could actually put yourself in the experience using the felt sense of your body, for example, instead of just visualizing. In fact, I imagine the more systems we've got online, the more real it becomes, the more powerful it becomes.
Brilliant, Anna. That's absolutely the case, that the more of our senses that we bring to this process, the more deeply somatic it becomes. And you are so right that imagination is the key, and it's the central factor in all of this. And from a neurobiological point of view, not just the unconscious employs imagination, because actually, from a neurobiological point of view or an evolutionary point of view, let's go back even further. Memory, the purpose of memory isn't just to have a picture book of our past, because that doesn't really serve us, our survival level, but it's instead to picture the future and move into the future. So the purpose, the very purpose of memory is to plan and move into the future. And so how we have been treated or how we treat ourselves tends to be the template for what we imagine will happen in the future. And again, from a neurobiological point of view, perception and imagination travel the same pathways, the same circuitry in the brain and body, which is fascinating. It's an amazing finding. It's why athletes can practice their sport or their discipline in their mind, and it actually will make a difference in their body. And in fact, the better they are at what they do, the better they can use their mirror neurons and their imagination when watching someone else do a sport, or when imagining themselves doing it, for actual practice in a way that changes the body, even the muscles, even the muscle tone of the body. It's quite incredible. The big difference between imagination and perception is that perception is a little more bottom up, meaning from the body to the mind. And imagination is just a little more top down, from the mind to the body, but they both have this circular flow that cross-fertilizes each other. And so you brought up the visual cortex, or the visual part, and it's very interesting that of all of the senses, vision is the one that coordinates all the others the most. And so it is quite powerful to be able to use vision in the imagination. So, for example, there's a really interesting tape online where, compared to sound, a person is going either ma, 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 or ba, ba, ba. And what you hear will depend on what you see the person's lips doing, which is fascinating that it can be that powerful. That said, even blind people can use their imagination quite effectively. And that's because really it's whatever sense is available to us. And so people have different senses, as you say, the somatic sense of how the body is. Gut feelings are really important to imagination, not just seeing things in our mind. So being able to see, being able to hear, being able to understand, each person being able to understand which of the senses are the most powerful in coordinating their ability to move themselves through their imagination. And the more of the senses that get open, the better, but not to worry if someone can't visualize explicitly, because it's not dependent solely on that. It's really dependent on being able to open up as many of the senses as possible.
And I really want to grab hold of here as well the embodied reality of this, the way in which using the imagination is, as you said in that first thing, imagining being well parented or being gazed at by the perfectly attuned parent. how that over time becomes reality in the body, in just the same way as the original lack of attunement was reality in the body. Although as an adult doing it, you're bringing as well a metacognitive perspective in which you can contextualize and understand what happened to you, which is also a mode of healing rather.
Yes. So I would say yes and no to what you just said, because on the one hand, depending how early the damage was and how severe it was, there is a thing called the critical windows of development, which means that there are periods of time that are open optimally to certain aspects of development, and those shift over time. And so some of what happens to us early on is irreversible because it shapes the pathways in ways that really can't be shifted, on the one hand. On the other hand, the other part of what you said is really critical, that as adults, we do bring other faculties and our conscious mind to the process as well. And those are faculties that we did not have as children. And so part of compassion work is understanding some of these natural limitations to how we can grow and change over time, and to accepting ourselves as we are as the starting point. And that's a really, really critical part of any sort of healing process, is beginning exactly where we are. I give you an embodied imagination thing that I learned when I was just coming into practice from the Gestalt world, about trying to, the problem with trying to change ourselves before we accept where we are and who we are, exactly where we are. So I would stand up in my office, and I used to have a little footstool in between my chair and my patient's chair. And I would stand up, and I put the footstool right in front of my legs. And I would say, I want to get over there. And I would point directly in front of myself. And then I would start to trip because I would try to walk straight and I'd hit the footstool. And so I'm not taking into account where I am, exactly where I am starting. And so this, when I do take into account where I'm starting, I can look down, I can see that my feet are blocked by the footstool, and I can just walk around it and still go in the direction that I'm interested in. So it's really, really important for people who want to make major changes in their lives to start exactly where they are. In the case of chronic fatigue and this sort of thing, it's to embrace the state. It's to embrace the meaningfulness of having gotten here in life and the lessons that these states can teach us and how they can help us to move to another state, because life is inherently dynamic, and it's only in our minds that we get stuck in one place.
Yeah, exactly. See, I've experienced my own fatigue, not all the time, because, when you first get chronic fatigue, you experience it as a massive limitation that you struggle with. And it's a kind of undoing of a former notion of yourself as competent, driving your body around, whatever you're doing. But there's a sense in which one can come, I think, to appreciate fatigue as itself a mode of deep and loving attunement. It is a deep form of wisdom. And I could honestly say that my fatigue has reparented me, both directly and indirectly, through what it's asked me to do, for what I've had to do in terms of evolving the self, evolving the capacity for self-compassion, evolving the capacity for self-remodeling and going into the unconscious and doing all that work. But not just that work, layers of embodied work, including diet and all, the multiplicity of layers is really, really deep. But I do think that there is a really gracious, wise generosity almost in conditions like fatigue. And as you say, starting where you are and appreciating that this is a lesson, this is a wake-up call, this is something to engage with at a very deep level, is so important, because for as long as we're resisting, in a sense, that's a form of failed attachment to reality. And it's a form of failure of self-attunement if we can't sit where we are and acknowledge where we are.
Exactly. And I think one of the deepest aspects of chronic fatigue is the press to be still and with ourselves, that is the goal of meditation. And so there's a spiritual quality to the ability to sit still with ourselves and to ask ourselves at these deeper levels what we need. And monks sit in caves for years to find those lessons. And so this allows us to go deeper with ourselves and get beyond the busyness and bustle of everyday life, especially if we've been moving too fast, which I believe a lot of people who develop chronic fatigue syndrome have been moving both too fast and under too much stress that they haven't been paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very common pattern. Folded into this, I sense there's the possibility of us exploring the notion of attunement to what is in a deeper sense then, because there's something, isn't there, about meditation and fatigue and coming home to sort of like the deeper portals of meaning making that these things evoke, that allow us to feel ourselves as part of a more intelligent, enormous whole that is attuned to us perfectly, whether we experience that or not. And I'd love to explore that with you, Terry. And I know that you use fractals as one insight into this kind of web of intelligent energy. And I'd love you to speak to that through the lens of attunement.
Absolutely. A beautiful segue, I would say, Anna, there. In that, this deeper level of patterning. Well, first of all, let me go back to your use of the meaning making, because meaning making really is at the heart of fulfillment in life. And it's important for people to recognize that meaning, when we make meaning out of situations, it's not the same thing as feeling good or necessarily having what we want in life. But when we're able to make meaning, we can transform any traumas and any difficult situations through a connecting thread of purpose and of the sense that the experience is transporting us. And when we do that, we surrender to a larger whole, as you're saying. And it's unfortunate that for thousands of years, our Western culture has had a very fragmented kind of logic and reductionist kind of logic, where we take wholes and we break them into parts. And then we deal with those parts and we try to put them together. And unfortunately, our Western medical system is brilliant in many ways because of this. But it also tends to treat our bodies and ourselves in terms of the different parts, with different people specializing in different parts. And when we get used to this point of view, it's easy to feel isolated. It's easy to feel separate from the world around us. But if we look at how nature works, we can think, first of all, we can think of our bodies as the temple of our soul. And we can think of nature as the temple of our bodies. And Mother Nature, there's a reason we have this metaphor of Mother Nature, because we are connected. We are deeply connected to nature and to one another. through, it turns out that fractals are the pattern of all patterning in nature. And it's a very holistic kind of pattern where the pattern of the whole is repeated in the pattern of the parts. Now, some people would say, well, that's what God is. And many religions look at God that way, that humankind is fashioned in the shape of God, or that God is internal and is transcendent and immanent in all of us. And fractal patterns are the same. And some people call fractal patterns the fingerprints of God. If you look at the Mandelbrot set, which is the granddaddy of all fractals, and fractal is a shape where the pattern of the whole is in the pattern of the parts. It's a very holistic way of looking at nature and looking at ourselves and our, if you look all around us, clouds and mountainscapes and riverbeds and tree branches are all fractal shapes, and they're inside us as well in the branching patterns of our neurons, in the branching patterns of our lungs and our circulatory system. And so these fractal shapes actually are both around us and inside us, and have a very interesting quality to them, that their edges are open. And so the way in which we fear we're separate from each other and the world around us, from a scientific point of view, is actually an illusion of our mind, because our bodies are completely open to the world. Just think of the fact that we have to take breaths. If we don't breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, and if we don't eat food, if we don't take water, if we don't expel waste. So our bodies are these open portals, and yet they are functionally closed in a sense of self, and we tend to identify with that. But if we look at the reality, we are deeply connected to the world around us, to nature around us. And I have developed a fractal epistemology where I take these principles of how fractal geometry work and look at their implications. And part of that is this deep interconnection to one another, especially at the level of the unconscious, which is one that the level that our unconscious is in our bodies, and our bodies are in the world in these open fractal portals. And so it becomes a way to address spirituality through science, through nonlinear science. And it certainly has given me awe to look at these principles and understand how they circle around to ancient wisdom of many practices, especially mystical practices.
This is where I get a bit excited as someone who works a lot with hypnosis, but I get very excited about the observational capacity of the unconscious, the 20 million bits of information a second that it processes, opposed to, they think, 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information that the cognitive conscious mind can process. So unconsciously, we're taking in information through our whole sensory capacity that we're not even aware of. But if we're attuned to our unconscious, we can pick up that information in a split second without needing to understand it. As you say, we get out of our own way. And it's coming to that place of, I guess, beginner's mind, not knowing, the willingness to be trusting, to trust the flow. And again, I come back here to attachment again, because it seems to me that there is a skill here that goes into the very orientation to life. That if we have the capacity for secure attachment to life, that's the capacity to relax, let go, and trust, knowing that life is there for us. If we have an avoidant pattern, we might withhold and self-block. And if we're anxious, we might over-control. So all these patterns can kind of go all the way through.
One of the words you're using about flow, I think, is key. It's really key because when you look at early attachment dynamics, it's how does the mother or how does the caregiver get into a flow, a rhythmic flow with that baby? And it's a flow that's not always again, pleasant, because baby's going to be crying, baby's going to be expressing distress at various points. But the flow is the response to that and helps soothe it and helps move it. And if we can relax into our intuitive side and self-trust and self-attachment and self-attunement, then we can flow through all these states in a positive way, in a way that is neither, as you put it, avoidant, where we're constricting into ourselves, or overthinking, where we're trying to control. I mean, those are, it's the sweet spot in between those where we can let go and be productive without expending too much energy.
This really brings to mind, it might be a little left field, but it brings to mind that there's something called the trust technique. Have you seen that? It's this guy who works with disturbed animals, and he's done it ever since he's a child. And essentially the practice is you go into a very mindful state, and you listen in to the creature, the dog, the horse, the tiger, whatever it is. You listen into it. So you're meditating, but attuning. And at some point, that animal's nervous system just settles down and trust is born. Now, I think that's a wonderful metaphor for what we need to do with ourselves sometimes. When the little beast is running around inside with its hackles up or disturbed, to create that space in which we sit and we just attune, and we safely hold that. And I think I thought of it because of what you said about the flow between the carer and the infant, that when the infant is unsettled, it's the carer's ability to hold that space without becoming unsettled themselves that allows the infant to know that it's safe to be unsettled, and in time to soothe when it's right, or the nervous systems align and the carer's nervous system will bring the baby down, whichever way it works, right? So there's something there, isn't there, about just being present to.
Yes, I love that. And now you're bringing to mind a trip that I took to Costa Rica to a pony farm, where the woman was married to a horse whisperer. And when I arrived, there was a colt had just been born 2 weeks before. And I watched this man just be able to move his hands without touching the horse. And the horses would follow his lead in the air. It was like he was doing magic. But the way that he operates with the young colt, when the colt is born, apparently there's a critical period in time where if the human touches every part of the colt, of the baby horse, then the baby will perceive the human as being part of the herd, and as opposed to a predator, because humans are considered predators by horses normally. And this way they become part of the herd. And so that process of touching every single part of that little baby is very much like what you're talking about of creating that space and holding that space for ourselves. It's the ability to really see and be with all the parts of ourselves, even the parts that we don't like, we don't want, our shadow side, etc. Just holding them, and there will be that natural settling and soothing and getting into flow, build a greater ability to get into flow with ourselves. And then this magical thing happens when we get into flow, where we are able of taking on more and more with less and less energy, less and less output.
Yeah, and I think, Terry, that's a wonderful place to end this for fatigue sufferers. The idea of taking on more with less energy because of being in the flow. And I guess as well, part of this as well is releasing unconscious blocks so that the energy is flowing, so that we're just energetically opening, and being utterly present and touching every dimension of self with non-judgmental, loving hands.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's lovely to talk to you as ever.
And thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation, because I just enjoy so much how you listen so deeply, and then you bring the conversation to a new place and help me think about things I've thought about in totally different ways and different applications. It's quite lovely.
Oh, thank you. That's a very humbling compliment, and I'll take it. Thank you very much, Terry.
You're very welcome. And I hope our listeners enjoy this segment.